Hello there, my friend, and welcome to the Ayurveda and Psychology podcast. I am Charlotte Skogsberg, your host for this podcast. I am enchanted to meet and to take you with me on this journey into the human psyche, viewed from the holistic approach of yoga and Ayurveda, and viewed from the modern man approach of clinical psychology and psychoanalysis. So have something nice to drink next to you, maybe a cup of tea, have a seat, or go out for a nice walk in nature maybe. Enjoy. In today's episode that I would like to dedicate to the field of psychology more, I am going to talk to you about the concept of self-image. Now, there are a few things that I would like to say about this before I actually go into talking about what it is. There are different ways of speaking of self-image as an image that we have of ourselves, as an image that we would like to project out towards others as well. And those two usually are quite different, and I would even say maybe quite the opposite, who knows. And it is very often linked to self-esteem and confidence. So that basically the image that I have of myself, if it's quite low, if it's quite negative, it means that I have all these thoughts about who I am that don't really value me, okay? Which means that my self-esteem is pretty low, and which means that I don't have much confidence. And so this, on a surface level, is quite easy to see, and it seems actually quite one-dimensional in a certain way. We easily talk about self-esteem and confidence without understanding that there's underlying factors that are far more controlling of the image that we have consciously about ourselves than just this idea, once again conscious about my own esteem for myself or how confident I am in different situations. Because very often what happens, which we don't understand usually unless we've been tapping into the field a little bit more, is that a really negative underlying idea will easily be compensated by, or try to compensate in the conscious realm, as the opposite. So this is why the very popular trends that are also really quite misleading about what narcissist is, and that everyone's all of a sudden a narcissist and an empath and all of this, which are not, and let me clear that one out, terms that comes from the clinical psychology field, okay? It doesn't come from the professions. So it's also important not to tap into that. But anyway, the idea that a narcissist, for instance, is someone who has a very high esteem of themselves is completely wrong, because the underlying belief would be instead the complete opposite, which is why the so-called narcissist will try to blow up into extreme the image that they want to project out to others about themselves. Okay, so it's not that the narcissist has a very high esteem of themselves. On the contrary, the underlying issue is the opposite. So, also when we talk about self-image, it is not really something that you find in the field of clinical psychology either, at least did not in my studies. Because the first one who started talking about self-image was not a psychologist, but plastic surgeon, Max Mulzer. And he noticed that people would come to see him about issues that they wanted to take care of. So operations to change features in their face, for instance, or other things, because it was really playing onto how they felt about themselves, or the conscious image that they had about themselves. And what he noticed was that after having made the changes that they asked for, there would be two different outcomes. There would be the outcome of the person being happy with it and moving on in life in a better way, let's say, with a better image of themselves, more confident and with a higher esteem. And then there would be the other ones who did not notice a change, and who might even have gone that far that they did not notice the change physically that had been done to them. And they would go as far as to turn back against him, saying that he had not actually made any changes, even though objectively he had. So what made him really intrigued was, of course, this part of the people. This means that there are people out there, basically most of us, who have an image of themselves that exists within them, which is something that they see when they look themselves in the mirror, but it's not actually what they see on an external vision. It is an underlying idea about themselves that they see. Now, if we would go into quite strong, more pathological versions of this, it's what we find in, for instance, body dysmorphia, right? So anorexia, which would be one of the very striking types of this, is the person losing more and more weight, going so deep down that they become a threat to their own survival, because they have basically no more fat on their body and they're looking almost like a corpse. But what they see when they look in the mirror is not that. They see too much fat for some reason. So what we have come to understand nowadays about anorexia, which is a modern also sickness, is that, of course, it doesn't really concern the body fat as much as it has underlying beliefs. And we've also then come to understand that it's not the actual fat on the body that disturbs the person when they look themselves in the mirror. There's something else. Because otherwise they would be capable of seeing that basically they are killing themselves, which they don't, right? So this means that when we work with issues that concerns our physical appearance, for instance, that just don't seem to go away no matter what we try to do, then we have to begin to dig underneath, because there seems to be something else that has formed that image that we see when we look ourselves in the mirror, which is also why he then called it self-image, because it's the image of yourself that is not linked to the objective reality, which is what someone else would see or what we would actually see if we would look at the reflection coming from the mirror. But it's linked to something that we see through, well, let's say, filters that we have in front of our eyes. And I like to make the comparison with a pair of sunglasses. Let's say that you wear a pair of sunglasses with a pink filter on, but you've worn them your whole life and you've never taken them off. It is conceptually impossible for you to understand what someone else is saying when they're telling you that the world is not pink. Or you would even not actually say that the world is pink, because for you this would just be what the world looks like. So this is basically what our self-image is, and why it's so difficult to work on it, since we cannot conceptualize the idea that there is a different kind of reality. Before going into the how and the why about this image, about these filters that we wear, we could almost simplify it as much to say that most of the things that we do in life that we find hard to undo or that just doesn't seem to be logical or not serving for ourselves are linked to these filters that we have about ourselves. So basically, we sabotage for ourselves a lot. We do things that aren't actually moving us forward, for instance. So we're having this low self-esteem due to the underlying ideas that we are not aware of, but that are actually what we really see when we look ourselves in the mirror. So how come we have this? And how come my image about myself is different to the image that someone else has about themselves? Yet, strangely enough, we also find a lot of these images that have common denominators, or similarities, I should say, in between different people. Basically, as a lot of the research in the field of psychology and even just sociology as well has showed, is that the underlying feeling of shame is very common in most people. And in order to understand that, I would like for you to come back to the idea that we are born completely helpless. We're born and we have one instinct, which is to survive. We come into this world and we know that we need to survive somehow. And because we cannot take care of ourselves when we are born, we rely on the people around us to do so, which means that we instantly begin to work on bonding with the people around us. Now, normally we talk about parents, the caretakers, right, in the first realm, and then we also have, of course, the closest family, so the other people that will be around us, that could be, for instance, siblings, when we are in our first years of life. And so, of course, depending on where we are born in the world, at what time in history, and what is the cultural and socio-economical environment that we are born into, we will learn to survive in different ways, let's say. For instance, if you would look at really, really old photos from, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, and you would see these, these black and white photos of families or even just of children. You'd see that the children are usually put in clothing like small adults. Because actually, 100 years ago, and before that as well, of course, children were basically just seen as small adults, which means that they were treated in a way that the adults would be, let's say, if they were just small. It took long into we started getting into more research about behaviorism and the brain, and of course from Freud, starting to look into the unconscious, that we began to realize that actually children are not small adults because the brain of a child is not developed fully, and there's plenty of things that are still growing and maturing inside of a person while they're still a child. So there's, for instance, a reason for that. That is the reason, when we set a limit on at what age you can start practicing for a driving license. Because actually a child's vision, like the range of the field where you can see, is narrowed and actually grows into its full spectrum when you come into adolescence and into early adulthood, which is why there's usually the limit of somewhere between 18, 19, 20 before you can actually pass your driving test. So this means that as we come into this world, depending on at what time in history, let's say, that this happened, you will also have been treated in different ways. But of course, because you were treated a certain way, you learned that this is how you are being treated, and this is how you then will treat others, because you know what we can't what we can't learn, we can't then reproduce, right? So we only do what we know, which means as well that even if anyone listening to what I'm talking about here today, were born in times where we had understood that children had special needs compared to adults, our parents might not have. And their parents, for sure, probably did not. Which means as well that there's traces from several generations before us in the way that we are treated from our parents, and that we will treat as well our own children or simply other people. So this means that when we come into this world, even if it would be the case that as a baby you're born with a blank sheet, all the things that you learn from day one are definitely not a blank sheet, but it's from generations from before. And also paradigm. So basically there are then, like I was mentioning with the small adults as children, but then other things as well, where we believe that this is right at one point in time, and then 20 years, 30 years, 50 years later, we realize that maybe that was not the case. And I mean, the past, 20 years, there's new things, especially when it comes to raising children, that come all the time. Just the whole debate around sleeping on the back or sleeping on the belly is actually something that has been changed many times over. So you have to take under consideration that the way that you were brought up, your first, let's say, 5 to 7 years in life, were very specific and, let's say, fresh learnings from your caretakers at that time. It does not mean that that was beneficial for you. There was plenty of things there that were beneficial for you, but not all. And then there's, of course, the things that your caretakers and that society was going through at that time as well that will influence the things that you learn from your caretakers, your parents. So, for instance, let's say that your mother was depressed. She was maybe suffering from postpartum depression, which is commonly known now, but wasn't that long ago. And even when it was also frowned upon. So it was very hush-hush and not to be shown, which means that there was a lot of shame around that. But a mother who goes through a postpartum depression is not always very capable of taking care of her child. Then there's, of course, the whole idea of that women should take care of children and men were completely disconnected even from their own children because they had never been taught how to take care of them. All they had been told was that they were supposed to provide everything for the family, so they were working. So then there's that part as well, which means that not only does that worsen or make more difficult the relationship that as a child you develop with your father, but also then with men in general. But then also as a small child, as you observe, for instance, your mother and your father, you will also learn how women and men interact with each other from what you see these people do. And you will also get the idea that women will treat you a certain way or men will treat you a certain way depending on how your mother or father treated you. So you can see just how complex our beliefs, that's what we often call them, the core beliefs we have about who we are and what the world should be, these filters, how complex they are depending on so many things. Now, it's also why I've chosen to make an online course in the matter of the self-image, because I find that it is one of the things where we can, with all these tools that we have accessible to us just by ourselves, that we can start to work on without having to pay thousands of whatever currency you're thinking in, thousands of dollars, I guess is the common thing to say, or spend many years on. We don't need necessarily to have another person there specifically for us to help us with this. We can actually begin to decipher the self-image on our own with simple tools. And that's also why spirituality has become, I think, such a useful tool in modern self-help world or self-improvement. I don't really like the word self-improvement because it's counterproductive. Realize that as soon as you start to say that you need to improve something about yourself, you are already in resistance of what is, because you are in the idea that what you are today needs to be changed. And so as soon as we find that something needs to be changed, we're resisting what is because we're not happy with what is. And as long as we resist it, we will always have resistance towards it, of course, and we will be struggling with it. And so it will be actually counterproductive. It's more when we accept and we allow for what is to be, that it changes almost a little bit by itself. So we start out learning all these things about the world and about ourselves, and we start to put on ideas about who we are and how we place ourselves amongst others, depending on all of this, what we see in the family. And then, of course, as soon as we begin to move around a little bit more, also with our peers, so with other people in our own age. And we then start to develop these ideas about ourselves. And without going into some of the deeper ones, some of the very typical ones that we all have and that we learn early on, and I want to say very early on in school age as well, because that's also when we start to place ourselves in society. What's a classroom if it's not a small version of society? With the boss and then everyone else, and then you create a hierarchy around it with, the strongest ones, the alpha male, the most popular girl, whatever, right? And so we learn things there that are linked to what we need to be in order to be desirable for other people around us to want to spend time with us. So, for instance, a little girl should be looking this way, or a boy should not cry. And then there are, of course, about our own capacity. So I am not good at math is a very common one, I think. Or I'm not good at spelling, or I'm not creative. I'm not good at anything creative. Or just look at, at the schoolyard in the recreational moments where there's the people who go and play some kind of sport, maybe football, whatever, or playing, doing this and that. And that's the whole also structure of a society that is formed. And since we are quite young, we're taking everything in that we learn there without a critical thinking to it. So we define ourselves very early on amongst these other people, because humans are flock animals, which means that we need the other people in order to feel safe and that we will survive. From a long time ago, the idea that we would be isolated from the rest of the group basically meant death, right? Just the same as there are we and then there are the others. And the others were another group of human beings that were usually quite far away. And we've noticed this in modern times as well when we do research in social psychology, for instance. Extremely interesting. They do these research groups with two groups of people and pretending to give them two different tasks, or the same task actually, but basically making them think that they're competing against one another. And they start very early on in the experiment to group themselves together with the other people that have the same tasks as them, or that has the same clue, or whatever it is that is different from the other group. And then the more you stay on it, the more you start to develop ideas about who the others are. Because also back from many, many, many years ago, there was the idea that the other group represented actually a threat to our survival. So there are a lot of things that are linked to survival instincts, once again, that continue even later on in life. So already we have been taught quite a few things from the childhood home. Then we come into our own little society through school. Then we were taught other things, and we would begin to really make a difference between us and them. And naturally, we have our own role in the group of us, and therefore later on in life that will still be present. And it's these filters that are placed on top of our sunglasses that have been there and that we have no idea how to take away, or that we're even supposed to take them away. So some of the things that are really important in these filters are a few sentiments, a few feelings that are detrimental to our own ego, because that's really what it is. It's the personality complex, the ego. And that is, of course, fear, because fear comes in as survival, and that fear will be developed into different things, like a feeling of guilt and a feeling of shame. And the feeling of shame then really cuts into the core of who we are, because the feeling of shame would be then that as I am existing, I am not actually good. And so I will therefore try to cover my feeling of shame as much as possible by developing opposite traits to that. And that's where we come back to the very beginning of what I was talking about, this idea of the surface, that where it seems as if the narcissist has a very high esteem of themselves, but actually no, there's a really most probably deep wounding of shame that had them create this opposite trait inside of them in order to compensate for that, so that they feel that they can survive. And as we begin to work on the self-image, one of the tools that I have given in the online course is something as simple as journaling. Because actually when we journal every day, we begin to notice, in the beginning it might just be very conscious stuff and quite boring things about what I ate and how I'm this and this and that, but little by little we start to see patterns of behaviors where there's a common trait of some kind of thoughts that keep coming up, or we notice that we're focusing a lot on this or this or that, and little by little we begin to notice that there is a mood that is settled in us that we might not be aware of in our daily doings, because we're so occupied with distracting ourselves that we don't really want to pay attention to that mood that's like an underlying maybe sadness or a fear or an anger or a frustration. But that pops up as we journal. And then we might even begin to notice that there's a really low self-esteem, and we might even notice that the self-esteem is kind of honing in on something as specific as our physical appearance. And it might be something specific in our physical appearance. And then we might even start to notice that as soon as we start to think about this outside of the journaling, or maybe even while we journal, we tend to reach for one or another of these distractions that might be, for instance, toxins like cigarette or alcohol, or something else, food or coffee, that actually then are our ways to distract ourselves from something that is happening in the very real of this moment that's popping up to the surface. And so we want to distract ourselves, we want to feel a little bit better, which is why we reach for this, and that is actually how we form addictions. So when we start to look into, okay, so what are the different things that I seem to be addicted to? And then what are the underlying thoughts that I've noticed through my journaling, for instance, that seems to pop up whenever I feel the craving for this thing that I'm addicted to? We begin to decipher even more of these underlying beliefs. And that's how we begin to decipher the self-image. If you are interested in knowing more about your own self-image, you can go to my website, yogisha.com, and purchase the online course that is called the Self-Image Project. And therefore you can take this on your own in your own pace, or you can also do it a little bit more in interaction with me if you find that that would be beneficial for you. You can always get in contact directly, of course, to have more information about this as well. And also, if you would be interested to actually work with me on one-on-one, using maybe even this course as our tool in between. thank you so much for choosing to listen to this podcast and this episode. I am very grateful. If you enjoyed this and you think that other people could enjoy this, please help me to spread the word. Share this episode on any channel that you have of social media or messaging. And even more so, I would really appreciate if you know one other person who might benefit from my words today specifically. Take that 1 minute it takes to simply share this episode with one person. Remember that there's a human being on the other side of your phone, of your earpods, of this microphone. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what I've been talking about. So please leave a comment. Send me a message directly if you wish. This is Charlotte. This is me. See you next time. Namaste.